In this demonstration, I'm going to show inner and outer curves and how to deal with those. This is a little bit different than sewing curves while easing because both of these pieces match each other. But you might encounter something like this where you have a shaped piece, say in a collar, in other various forms that you're putting two things together, flipping them and turning them, and they are not square or rectangular. So I want to show you good techniques in how to do these things and how to flip them and press them out smoothly. So first I'll be taking what I call my outer curve. So this is a curve that is going to create sort of a half circle shape like this. I'll sew it, I'll clip it and turn it, and then I will show you sort of the opposite where the curve goes into the piece that you're sewing an inner curve and how to deal with that as well. So let's start off by stitching my line. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch seam allowance, as I often would in many of my garments. And I'm just keeping a careful eye on my seam allowance line and very slowly rotating this fabric, turning it ever so slightly as I feed it through the machine. Be sure not to go through a curve too fast. You could be stretching it out of shape. You could also get off your mark if you go too fast, so take time. Back stitch at the end. And then I'll go ahead and show you how this would be clipped and turned properly. So if I'm sewing something, say a Peter Pan collar edge or similar, that would have a curvature around the edge, I would sew it like that. Then I'd go back with my scissors and I would clip little bit by little bit as I make my way around that circle. And these clips are going to help me turn and press this more evenly. Also, in some circumstances where you're dealing with a really tight curve, it may also be wise to trim down your seam allowance to a narrower amount. This will get rid of some of the bulkiness in that seam, because you'll notice as you turn it to the inside, that seam allowance is going to cross or bunch up. So sometimes getting rid of some of it is also wise. But first, I'm going to get my trusty iron out and my pressing ham. This is my pressing ham here. I'm going to use the edge of the pressing ham to help me open this curve up and press it well. So it's not just a matter of carefully sewing in that curve, but also clipping, turning, and pressing it well. You can see I've opened the little pieces of seam allowance there. I can turn and rotate it on my ham so that it works better for me. And I will just keep making my way around this curve to press it. Do be careful of your fingers as you press, that you get them out of the way, especially if the steam. Often the steam gets you before the iron itself does. And you can see me start to work on this edge of the curve. Almost there, just a few more tabs. Again, sometimes your curve needs to be stretched just a bit to fit the edge of your ham and to lay cleanly. Do whatever you need to do to get it as open and smooth as you possibly can. Then I'm going to turn this piece right side out. So I've got this little half a circle piece. It's clipped and pressed once. Then I will turn it right side out. And you can go back and stretch it back over the ham if you need to. If you notice that there's a little place that didn't get pressed well, you can see there's like a little bit of extra fabric here that didn't get quite as open as maybe I'd like it to. And go back and smooth that portion out. Pressing it from both directions is the wisest thing that you can do. Don't trust that you got it right on the first try. That's rarely the case. And then, as I'm happier with how that has pressed out, I will go back. And if this were, again, like a Peter Pan collar edge, this would want to lay flat and smooth. So I'll make sure my seam is right on the edge there. Occasionally we sew scalloped edges into garments. So these techniques would also be very effective for that. And the goal is to have a nice clean edge, nice finish to that, crisp and flat with. And you can tell if you haven't done a great job, you can see like kind of one place right here where it's a little more angular or pokes out. If it starts to look like a stop sign, if it looks like a hexagon or an octagon where there are distinct points, that means you've clipped too far apart and you're spanning too much curve, and you need to clip closer together so that you get a smoother, more even edge to that curve as you press it out. Now, if I were doing the opposite curve, it functions a lot in the same way, but you'll notice that the seam allowances, once I flip it, behave a little bit differently. So in my outer curve, when I flip it, all these seam allowances are going to overlap each other and cover each other up a little bit. That's because the seam allowance was wider than the curve itself, right? If I were drawing two circles on top of each other as I'm drawing that seam allowance, I would be drawing a larger circle, so it has to cave in on itself once you flip it. The opposite will happen here, and that seam allowance will splay apart more. So you can see how these curved seam allowances behave a little bit differently when you try it in the other form of the curve. So real quick, I'll go over that. And I've provided myself a seam allowance line on this one just because when I traced the curve, I had to mark my own seam allowance here. You can see me trimming my seam allowances just like I did before. The tighter the curve, the more clips that you need. The more gradual the curve, then you can get by with fewer clips. So keep that in mind, especially if you're working on a garment where that curve is not consistent, right? I'm working in a sort of a perfect half circle. That's not always the case in garments. We have curves that turn sharper or more gradually and then smooth out into other lines. So as that curve changes, just be aware of how tight it is. I'll do pretty much the same thing as I did before in opening this up and stretching it a bit over an edge so I can get a nice press. Again, you can flip your hem around to figure out the most comfortable and best solution to your edge. Again, as your curve changes, which edge of the ham you press against also changes. If I can get it to behave. And then again, I'm going to smooth it out from the opposite direction to make sure that that seam is as open as it can be. Now you can see that curve starting to take shape. And what I mentioned about your seam allowances splaying out, you can see that here, that you've got quite a bit of space, triangles in between this seam allowance. So it's able to open and relax, whereas in the opposite curve we were covering up. almost finished. We'll go back once more again and iron my curve flat. You can see the inner curve here, now crisp and clean and taking shape.